Hello to all grade 11 life science learners. Our next session is actually a combination of two aspects. So if you look at the screen here, first thing we're doing is we're looking at the modification of of the basic body plan, and the second section will deal with biogeography. So those are the two main aspects of this session. So looking at the key concepts, we'll be looking at homologous structures, and important, what the basic body plan is, and how is this basic body plan adapted, especially as organisms are exposed to different environments. Then we will look at flightless birds. These are a group of birds called the ratites, and we as South Africans have the largest of the group, where we of course know it's the ostrich. And then we'll also then look at the world distribution of these ratites and connect this to the continental drift that we spoke about, or that you were taught in grade 10 life sciences. Right, so this section number 1, I'd say, is your modification of your basic body plan. So what we're going to look at is your definitions, very important. Remember, life sciences is like a language on its own, so these definitions and terms are quite loaded, so in other words, they carry quite a bit of meaning with them, so it's important to know your definitions. We're going to look at the structure of the vertebrate limb. We're going to see how these limbs are adapted for its function, and then basically look at homologous structures, and specifically looking at homologous structures as evidence for evolution. So the first phrase or term we need to know is basic body plan. If you look carefully, it is the basic components and the arrangement of those components or organs or structures based on its grouping, based on the organism's grouping. So what that means is, if you look at humans, all humans basically have the same organs, so they are internally arranged the same. Where another organism, if you look at something like the housefly, it would not have the same organs. It would have different organs, which would also then be arranged differently. So our basic body plans are totally different from the body plan, for example, of the common housefly. The next term is homology. Looking at this, we see it's two structures or two things that share a common evolutionary origin. A common evolutionary origin. And remember, previously I had just mentioned to you that we're going to look at homologous structures as evidence for evolution. So it basically indicates, well, when we talk about the human hand and the flipper of the whale, and we look at some examples later, you can see that it basically comes from a common ancestral ancestor. Let's move on to the next term. The next one is analogy. And here you can see there are similarities in its functioning. But even more important than that is the fact that you must realize they do not have a common ancestor. And that's the big difference between homology and analogy. So what you find here is, as an example, the wings of a bat versus the wings of an insect. So what we have here is, and just a quick way to remember it, analogy, they will have the same function, but they don't have a common ancestor. In the case of the homology mentioned previously, they will have a common ancestor, but their functions may be different. So that's an easy way to remember the two, or to distinguish between them. So, moving on. Here we look at the structure of the pentadactyl limb. Penta meaning 5. The dactyl here means finger. So your 5-fingered limb. And just to show you, here we have the wing of a bird. Here we have the flip of a seal, bat's wing, the human arm, and the forelimb of a horse. And what I want you to see is that the fundamental structure is basically the same. So looking at the bones, can you see there we have the humerus? All of them have a humerus in. It has changed based on the environment in which these organisms live and the function that it does. Look carefully, you'll see the next one. You can see here we have the radius, there we have the radius, there we have the radius. So you can see that all these structures, all these pentadactyl limbs actually have all the basic anatomy is exactly the same. So we can have a look here. There's the humerus, there's the radius and the ulna, your carpals, which makes up, for humans, which makes up our wrist, our metacarpals, these larger sections of the fingers here, in other words the palm of the hand, and in the fingers that would be your phalanges. So look carefully. The seal, the bird, the bat, the horse, and the human arm all have the same bones in the same position, just that the functions may of course be different. Now the fact that they have the same bones in the same position means that it is considered evidence for the fact that it has a common ancestor. Let's move on. Here I just have a little diagram indicating the adaptations, which I will discuss in more detail, but just indicating to you, there you can see, there you have your pentadactyl limb with its various components, the humerus, radius, etc., and how it is adapted for the bird, for the bat, how it is adapted for the dolphin, for swimming, how it is adapted for the mole so that it can dig, for the horse so that it can run, etc. But we'll go through each of those individually. Right, so looking at this first example here, there you have the mole, and we know that the pentadactyl limb is adapted for digging, and there you can see the limbs, okay? So the bones in the forelimb have become much shorter. So it's shorter and it's more compact, and that makes it a lot stronger, which means that these limbs are now more effective for digging, of course, especially when the mole is underground. Next one we have the bat, and there you can see a bat in flight. So these bones of the bat, you can see here, they are thin. You can see it's much thinner. Look at the human humerus. Look at the bat's one there. Look at these structures here, much thinner. Look at the phalanges. So all of them are thinner. They are also long. Well, first of all, they are thinner. The advantage of it is that it is lighter. Secondly, the fact that it is long means that the wingspan of this bat will be enlarged, which makes it a more effective flyer. And then, of course, these bones are very light, again making it very light. In other words, the total mass of the organism will then be less, which makes flying much easier. Let's look at the horse. Here you can see as an example, here you have the structure of the human leg. Here you have the structure of the horse. And you can see basically the same structure. In the case of the horse, we all know about horse racing, so they can run quite fast. And if you look carefully, here they mention here that the humerus is short and the rest of the bones are long and very strong. You can see that this horse here has quite a mass, in other words, quite a large body that it must actually carry during this running process. So these bones need to be as strong as possible. Number 4, there you have your seal. There you can see flippers that are adapted for swimming. Okay, and you can see, if you look carefully here, you'll see there you have the humerus, your radius, and your ulna. Look carefully and you'll see that they are relatively short. Okay, and if they are shorter, they are more compact, and that means that they would be more powerful, in other words, in the swimming process. Last but not least, our monkey for climbing trees. But they don't just climb trees, they of course also have the ability to manipulate food and other objects like humans do. So let's just see what advantages we have here. The bones are elongated. The longer the arms, the longer they can reach. And because they move, they live in trees, they have an arboreal lifestyle, they need to be as light as possible. That's why the bones are thin and the bones, of course, are light. Finally, the phalanges, which of course your little digits here, they are elongated somewhat. Okay, they are, in other words, the phalanges would be longer than that of humans, and that would make it much easier to grip. If you look carefully there, you can actually see that their hand is somewhat elongated. In other words, it would be longer than the human hand, which makes it easy for it to grip as it moves from tree to tree. Then finally, here we have a little summary of the homologous structures. Going back to Darwin and his evolutionary theory. So what Darwin then says is that these structures have a common evolutionary origin. In other words, they have a common ancestor. And the reason for that is, as you can see here in the various colors, because the basic structure or the fundamental structure of the limb is the same. You can see, again, indicating there you have your little key. So there you have your humerus in all 4 of these organisms. You have the radius in all these organisms. And last but not least, let's go to the phalanges. You can see you have the phalanges. There we go. Phalanges. And finally, in the case of the humans, your phalanges. So the fundamental structure, the type of bones, the position of the bones is all the same, which to Darwin means this would be an indication that it has a common evolutionary origin or common ancestor. So why are these important? As I mentioned to you, it indicates evolutionary links. In other words, it provides evidence for evolution. What it also indicates is that groups can diverge from a common ancestor. What that basically means is, so here you would have your common ancestor, and from here it diverges as the organisms find itself in different environments. Then by a process of natural selection, we may eventually lead to the development of new species. And then, of course, through adaptive radiation, as indicated. Then just indicating your analogous structures. Now, please be careful. So far, we've been speaking about homologous structures. And remember, homologous structures have a common ancestor. That's the important aspect. That's why it is evidence for evolution. But it does not necessarily have the same function. Think of the leg of the horse versus the bat versus the flipper of the seal. So you can see it has a common ancestor, but in other words, the fundamental structure is the same, but the function is different. Horse runs on land, your bat, of course, flies in the air, so the environments are different, and because of that, there were adaptations. In this case, we are now talking about analogous structures. Now remember, in the case of analogous structures, you'll find that the function is the same. The function is the same, but there's no common ancestor. In other words, the origin, the evolutionary origin is not the same. So let's just have a look here. Here you can see, here we have, as an example, here we have an insect with its wing. Here we have, here this looks, there we have a bat. Here we have a bird. And now you can see that these two have similar fundamental structures. So have a look there. You can see, there we go, that bone is the same, that one is the same, phalanges there, the same. So the fundamental structure is the same. So these would be your homologous structures, but this one compared to that one, they would be analogous structures. Again, why? Because the homologous structures have a common ancestor. That is why they have a common fundamental structure. Analogous, they have a common function, but they don't have a common ancestor. So they're just mentioning, again, they have similar functions. In other words, they look the same, but they have, very, very important, is that they have a different evolutionary origin. And here just a little summary, just indicating what I showed you with the previous slide also, is that you have humans. In other words, there's the arm with the humerus and all the various bones that are exactly the same. Same there with the elephant. But if you compare the bird and the insect, you'll actually see that they have the same function, but not the same fundamental structure. In other words, the internal structure here on the inside is not the same, which means they are analogous structures. But the human compared with the bird, you can see colored differently. The fundamental structure is the same, common ancestor, so it is an example of homologous structures. Right, so this is the section on biogeography. Let's look at the key aspects we're going to look at. As I mentioned previously, is we must know our definitions. We must know our definitions. For example, if we think about some of the previous definitions that we discussed, homology. Homology basically says that something has a similar fundamental structure. Although the function is different, the fundamental structure is the same, and that is because of a common ancestor. So one word with a few letters is actually quite loaded. So it is important that we always know and understand our definitions. So that's the first aspect. Then we will look at the flightless birds. As South Africans, we have the ostrich as a very good example. Everybody knows the ostrich. We will look at the worldwide distribution of some of the more popular flightless birds or ratites. And then we'll see how the biogeography, the distribution of your ratites, etc., how it slots into Darwin's evolutionary theory. In other words, how it provides evidence for evolution. And we'll look at some of the conclusions that Darwin made based on some of those aspects. So let's get to the definitions. If we look at our definitions, the first one here is biogeography. Bio, again, referring to life. In other words, we're looking at all plant and animal life. So there we go. That's your bio. Geography, referring to land. So there we have our geographical distribution. And this is, of course, over space and time. So, biogeography, the geographical distribution of plants and animals over space and time. Then, everybody knows this one. It was part of our environmental studies last year, biodiversity, also a very important aspect because it relates to our natural heritage. So biodiversity refers to diversity, which basically indicates the number and the variety of different species. And when we talk about the species, we're talking about plant and animal species within an environment. This was mentioned previously, so I'll just briefly discuss it again. Adaptive radiation, quite simply, relates to evolution, and it relates to a common ancestor. And what happens is the different organisms then radiate. In other words, as I indicated previously, so there's your common ancestor, and now what happens is they move into different environments. So let's say this organism moves into water. The next organism is on land, and the other one, as an example, would now live in trees. So they have a common ancestor, but now what has happened is the environment in which these organisms are now living will change. And because the environment changes, what will happen is natural selection will take place, and what would happen is we will then have the development of different species as they then start adapting to their new environments. So that is basically your adaptive radiation. Right. We discussed this last year in grade 10, but it is important to understand in terms of biogeography. And this is the issue of continental drift. So what it basically means is that the land masses or our continents are constantly moving. There is a hypothesis or theory that currently it is still moving. So the question that everybody asks, but why don't we see any movement? If you look carefully, you'll see indicated here geological time. In other words, we're talking about millions of years. So what we have is, we started off with one large landmass, which was called Pangaea. And look at the difference. Look at the difference there. You can see it's almost 90 million years. So what has happened is it has now split. Pangaea has now basically split. And we now basically have the two sections. We have Gondwana land. And Gondwana land is, of course, where Africa originated from. And then you have Laurasia. That then moved on to about 65 million years ago. And if you remember, 65 million years, that was when we had the large mass extinction. So now you can see that Laurasia has actually broken up. So now you have Eurasia, which will eventually form Europe, and then of course Asia on this side. You can see from Laurasia there, you can see North America has broken off. And then if you look at the bottom section, you can see Africa has now separated from South America, which was all together when we had, 135 million years ago, when we had them all together as Gondwana land. And then, of course, we have our present distribution of the land masses as we know them: North America, South America, Antarctica. And then we have Africa, Europe, Asia, and then Australia. So that is the present arrangement. So looking at that, we can look at some fossil evidence. And what scientists have discovered was, they discovered that there were fossils found of the exact same organism in Africa as well as South America. So to just give an example here you have the Mesosaurus, which is a reptile. So what happened was, they found fossils in Africa and South America. But if we go back to our present distribution of land masses, we'll see that Africa and South America are quite some distance apart. But what they discovered was, at some point here in South America and here in the southern regions of Africa, they discovered fossils of this Mesosaurus. So that indicated that at some point these land masses were joined together, which meant that the Mesosaurus actually survived in that section of Gondwana land, and that is of course where they then died. And after a few million years, what had happened is that Africa and South America had separated, but the fossils of the Mesosaurus that died about 65 million years ago were still present in the soil of both of these continents. If we look at some other examples, we can see here we have the Glossopteris, which is a fern. And if you look carefully, the green section actually indicates that the Glossopteris was found all over Gondwana land. Here you can see, so we had it in Australia, it was in Antarctica, it was present in India, present in Africa, and finally in South America. So the idea was that if you find fossils for the same organism, and these on the different land masses, in other words, if you look at, would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different continents, that basically meant that at some point these continents were connected to each other. So where there would be free movement of the reproductive structures of these ferns. In other words, their spores. So, again indicating or providing evidence, and here you can see this green mass here indicating that there was a connection between these 5 large land masses. Then you can see here another last example, your Lystrosaurus, found in Africa. Just change the color. Found in Africa, so it will be found there, found in India, and found in Antarctica. Now again, it doesn't sound that dramatic if you look at this diagram, but if you look at the present distribution of land, you can see that Antarctica and Africa, they are quite some distance apart. Let's go back and see, the other one was India. There we go. So you can see that these 3 land masses are a few thousand kilometers apart, but they have the same fossils for the Lystrosaurus reptile, which indicates again that at some point India, Africa, and Antarctica was joined. Let's move on. Right. The next section deals with flightless birds. We all know birds, whether it is something as spectacular as an eagle to something as simple as a pigeon. Characteristic of birds is the fact that they can fly. But what we do find is we find a group of birds called the ratites. And the ratites are flightless birds. In other words, they do not fly. We had on the planet, we had the moa, which was the largest bird that was ever present on the planet, but it has become extinct. The moa was present in New Zealand. At the moment, we have a small flightless bird, the kiwi, which is present there. So there we have an extinct species, and that would be the moa from New Zealand. Then we have your extant species, your ostrich from South Africa, your emu in Australia, and the rhea in South America. So those are the four species of birds that you should know about. You should know where they are found. And you should at least know that it is the moa that is, of course, the extinct example of the ratites. So let's put these birds into perspective. Here you can see a beautiful example of an ostrich, and you can see that it has these very strong legs. There you can see, in other words, one of its adaptations, what makes it so unique, is that it has very heavy leg bones. Now remember, when we spoke about the adaptations for any form of flight, whether it was the bird or the bat, the idea was that they should be as light as possible and that they should be as thin as possible. But the reason for that was primarily for flight. But remember, the ostrich is an example of a ratite, which is a flightless bird. So if this bird can't fly, it should run quite fast. So these heavy leg bones, of course, with its strong muscles, with its strong attached muscles, makes it possible for the ostrich to run quite fast. Many of you may actually have seen some of the ostrich races, where the ostrich can actually have a large adult male on top of it and still run at quite a speed. Then you can see, look at this, if I can just change the color, you can see there, it has quite a large body. Again, most birds' bodies are relatively small. The reason for that is less mass, less energy expended for takeoff, and then of course for flight itself. So this bird doesn't fly, as all ratites don't fly, so they would have larger bodies, especially compared to their wingspan. And talking about the wings, quite obviously, if it doesn't fly, there's no reason for it to have an excessive wingspan. So your ostrich, as an example, have relatively small wings. Then you'll see there's a reference here to a flat sternum. Now, a flat sternum is slightly different in the case of ratites than your ordinary birds, because your ordinary birds have a keel, a special adaptation that allows for attachment of muscles involved in flight. Again, it's logical that if these are flightless birds, they don't need the additional muscles, so they won't have the adaptation on the sternum itself. Then last but not least, it has strong feet. It has to run fast, and particularly as in the case of the ostrich, in very dry environments. And last but not least, it has no opposing first toe. So the reason why it doesn't have an opposable toe is it doesn't live an arboreal lifestyle, so it doesn't have to be in trees. So it doesn't need the opposable toe, in other words, to grip the branches of trees. And that is why your ratites don't have this opposable first toe as mentioned. Let's move on. So here we're looking at the worldwide distribution. We can see, just basically putting the world map and the different species into context. So here you have your rhea, present in South America, nowhere else in the world. You have the ostrich, of course, in Africa, primarily southern Africa, but also higher up. So you would find the ostrich in Africa. The moa, mentioned previously, we used to find in New Zealand, but it is of course now extinct, so there are no living specimens available, although we do have a much smaller version, the kiwi, which is also present in New Zealand. And then finally we have the emu, and the emu, of course, a well-known bird from Australia. So, in summary, how does this biogeography, including aspects like the continental drift and the development of new species, how was that interpreted by Darwin? So let's just have a look. Darwin believed that all ratites are related. And the reason why he felt that they were related is, of course, that their basic body structure or their fundamental structure was the same, and that they came from a common ancestor. Then, the reason why there are the differences, in other words, if you compare the ostrich in South Africa, which is a bit larger than the rhea that you find in South America, it is of course due to environmental conditions. But when did the environmental conditions change? That of course changed when we have the splitting of Gondwana land. And that was due to this process that we refer to as continental drift. So, there was a splitting of these land masses, and the splitting of the land masses then led to a change in environmental conditions. And those change in environmental conditions then led to different species evolving as they started adapting to the differing environment. Now that we've looked at the content of the theory, let's look at some example questions. I have some multiple choice questions, so let's just go through them. Starting off with question 1.1. The question asks, what do we call the geographical distribution, there we go, underline it, of plants and animals over space and time? And based on our terminology or our definitions discussed earlier, you of course know that the correct answer is biogeography. So biogeography relating to the life, there you can see the bio, just connecting them. Let me just connect the dots just to make sense of it. The bio relating to the life, and the geography relating to the geographical distribution. So that is the correct answer for question 1.1. Question 1.2. Which one of the following is very important, not an example of a pentadactyl limb? Now remember I mentioned previously, a pentadactyl limb is basically a 5-fingered limb. So if we have a look, we'll see that the flip of a seal has the same structure, the same fundamental structure as our hand. The same thing for the bats. In other words, that one is correct. That one is an example. The wing of an insect? No. if you think of animal diversity, I mean, it's in a totally separate phylum. And then the leg of the horse, correct. So in this case, the one that is not representative of a pentadactyl limb would then be C, which is the wing of an insect. 1.3. Which one, again, of the following is not a characteristic of ratites? Now, important for us is remember that ratites are our flightless birds. In other words, our birds that can't fly. So, let's see. We mentioned a few characteristics, and one of it is that it has a flat sternum. Yes, it doesn't have the additional keel for the attachment of muscles necessary for flying. So that is correct. Do they have large wings? There's a question mark. It's a large bird, so we'll see. So C, large bodies. Yes, they have large bodies. They don't fly, and they have heavy leg bones. Yes. So by process of elimination and a little bit of logic, the correct answer here, of course, is B, which is large wings. There's no reason for your ratites, for example, if you think about the ostrich or the emu, if you think about them, they have very small wings because the wings are not adapted to fly. So there's no reason why they would have large wings, which makes the answer to question 1.3 B. So the last one here, which of the following flightless birds, okay, has become extinct? Now we know there are still ostriches in South Africa, okay. The emu we still find in Australia, the rhea still in South America, and the moa is the extinct bird, the extinct example of the flightless birds which was found in New Zealand. So it is now extinct, so the correct answer then for us for question 1.4 is A, the moa. Let's continue. Question 1.5. We have the bird's wings and the lizard's forelegs are examples of what? First of all, let's have a look here. Vestigial organs. Now remember, vestigial organs relates to evolution. So it's basically an organ that has lost its function and may also be reduced in size. Analogous structures. Analogous structures are structures that have the same function, but it doesn't come from a common ancestor. Where if you look at C, you have homologous structures. They may have different functions, but their fundamental structure is the same, and they come from a common ancestor. And then last but not least, we know fossils are, of course, the dead animals which have become fossilized through various processes. So if we have a look here, it is definitely not vestigial organs. Could it be that one? Maybe. Maybe. These organisms are still alive, so they're not fossils. So you can see here that we have, in the case of the lizard and the lizard's foreleg and the bird's wing, is that they have different functions. So that would not be analogous. So by process of elimination, it then gives us the answer of the bird's wing and the lizard foreleg being examples of homologous structures. Let's go to question 1.6. The question asks, analogous structures are, in other words, looking at the four options here, A, B, C, or D, which one of them would be analogous structures? So let's go back to our definitions. Analogous structures, they will have the same function, but they don't have a common ancestor. Homologous structures may have different functions, but it has a common ancestor. So let's just have a look. So the flipper of a dolphin and the fin may have slightly different functions, so that would exclude them. So for B, you can see a wing of a fly and a wing of a bird. Now remember, both of them have basically the same function. So it could be, I'll put a little question mark there, so it's a possibility. Wing of a bat versus the forelimb of a mole, two totally different functions, so that would exclude them. Wing of mosquito, leg of a frog, two different functions. So by process of elimination, but also knowing our definition, the answer, the correct answer for question 1.6 would be B. You can see that they are both wings, they are both involved in the same function, in other words locomotion, but they do not have a common ancestor. Let's move on to question 1.7. According to the theory of continental drift, now remember, continental drift basically told us that originally there was one large supercontinent, and eventually over a very long period of time, what had happened was these continents started moving away from each other, and that is why we have the location of the continents as we see it on the planet at the moment. So it mentions here that all of the land masses were joined together to form a supercontinent, and this is just one of those that you must know, and the correct answer here is, of course, Pangaea. Let's move on. Question 2. If we look at question 2, it says, and important to mention is that every time you get an illustration and you get an introductory paragraph, please take the time to read through the introductory paragraph and to take a moment to glance at or look at the diagrams, just so that you can get a sense of what it is all about. So let's just have a look. We're talking about the four limbs of mammals. Have different functions, yes, and they are built on the same body plan. Same basic body plan. Remember, we spoke about it previously. The basic body plan indicates the structures, the number of the structures, and how they basically fit into and make up the total organism. So if we look at the diagram, and I'll just go to a quick glance, here you can see this is a seal, and there you can see the forelimb of the seal. Here you have your horse, the forelimb of the horse. You have the monkey, forelimb of the monkey. And as you go through, there's the forelimb of the bat. And finally, the forelimb here of your mole. So, what does the question ask? The question asks, but how, explain how Darwin. Now remember, Darwin is the author. Darwin and Wallace is, of course, don't forget, is responsible for the theory of evolution by natural selection. So, we have Darwin, explain how Darwin used these similarities. Okay, so what about it is the same of the basic body plan of the forelimbs of different animals to conclude that they all evolved evolution from a common ancestor. So, if you have a look, you'll see one of our previous slides. We spoke about the same basic structure because, as you can see, there's the humerus, and you will have the radius and the ulna, and you will have your carpals and your metacarpals and your phalanges. So, if I go further down, look at this. Here I have the humerus, I have the radius, the ulna, the carpals, the metacarpals there, and your phalanges, indicating that they have the same basic structure. So how would Darwin connect this? What Darwin basically says is that all of these organisms have a pentadactyl limb. In other words, the basic structure, if we're arranging from, for example, the forelimb, from the humerus to the radius, to the ulna, to the carpals, to the metacarpals, and then to the phalanges, is the same in all 5 of those organisms. So what does that indicate? The fact that they all have a pentadactyl limb basically means that they all come from a common ancestor. And that is the most important aspect that that's the most important aspect that Darwin actually relates these homologous structures that he actually relates to as part of evidence for evolution. Let's look at the next question. 2.2, it asks, the forelimbs, there we go, have been modified for different functions. So, what are the forelimbs now used for in the mole? Here's the one, the horse, the bat, the monkey, and then finally the seal, respectively. Now remember, all of this was, of course, present, was mentioned in the previous section where we looked at the theory. But just to get an idea, just have a look, there you can see the limb of the forelimb of the mole. So you can see that would be specialized for digging. That would be specialized for digging. And how do you know that? Based on the previous presentations, you'll see that you have these the phalanges that are enlarged, and it basically creates a bigger claw, which then makes it possible for the mole to dig deep in the soil. Let's have a look at the next one. The horse, I think that's quite obvious. That would be for running. Okay, so let's go back and have a look. You can see how compact that structure is. Some of it has been enlarged, and that makes those limbs of the horse quite strong, which of course makes it easier to run much faster. Then you have your bat for flying. Let's go back and have a look, and there you can see, there you have the wing of the bat, and if you look carefully you'll see that these phalanges are somewhat elongated, so they are much longer so that they can create a larger surface for the wing. But what also happens is they are thinner and they're much lighter, which of course makes it much easier if in other words, in terms of the total mass of the organism. So all those adaptations makes it easier for the bat to fly. Our monkey, that would be manipulation. Manipulation would be the one aspect. And then also climbing trees would be another one. They're very similar to the human structure. Okay, very similar to human structure. So they have these elongated bones, which gives it the larger lower arm. The longer lower arm, and then of course you have the hand with the opposing thumb, which makes it very easy to grip something, and also makes it much easier, in other words, to grip, for example, branches of trees, which makes it much easier for them to climb. Last but not least, we have the seal, and there of course we have swimming. And you can see what has happened there is it has created a larger surface area, and by creating a larger surface area it would then offer more resistance when moving in the water, which of course makes the propulsion of the seal, in other words, it moving forward makes it much easier. Let's look at the next question. Still the same one with the diagrams, and the question is, what do we call structures important of different species that are similar to each other but arose from a common ancestor? I think everybody knows this answer based on our definitions. And the answer is, of course, we call these structures homologous structures. Right. Let's have a look. Again, we have a diagram and we have an introductory section. So the idea or the tip that I gave you is always read through just to get a sense of what you're talking about or what the question is going to be about. So ratites, they mention are flightless birds, we know that, and they are widely distributed across the globe. And scientists believe that they evolved from a common ancestor. Right, so now let's just take a moment, and here we have some of the birds. Here we have some of the birds. Ostrich, South African ostrich. There we have the kiwi, which is, of course, in New Zealand. Emu, Australia, and the rhea, which you find in South America. So let's look at question 3.1. So for question 3.1, it says, list 3 ways. Now remember I mentioned previously, if they ask for 3, only give 3. The rest is not marked. Ways in which ratites, these are flightless birds, differ from birds that can fly. Now, although I'm going to summarize it, I'm just going to put it in a little table. But do remember what you're doing here is you are comparing. So you can't just mention the characteristics of the ratites. You need to mention the aspects of the ratites as compared to birds that can fly. So although I'm going to tabulate it, you must write it out. You write it out in full sentences. And important for you to remember is that you must mention both aspects. As an example, if I just extend it here, there we go. So ratites have large bodies, while other birds, if you think about your pigeon, etc., they have smaller bodies. Remember, you can also write it, in other words, you can actually condense all of it into one sentence by simply saying that the ratites, or the basic body size or body mass of the ratite is greater than that of birds that can fly. So there are ways in which, different ways in which the same idea can be related. Most important thing is you must mention the aspects of both because you're comparing them. So let's have a look. If the ratites have large bodies, they can't fly, so obviously they have small wings. In the case of birds that can fly, they have larger wings. And very important to remember here, this is especially compared to body size. Then if we look at other aspects, we'll look at the ratites that have a flat sternum. Compared to that, and the reason why they have a flat sternum is they don't have the additional keel that allows for attachment of muscles that promotes flying. So in the case of the birds that fly, the sternum has a keel that allows for muscle attachment. Okay, so those are some of the examples. Most important to remember. Can you see what I did? I wrote down 3. And that's the most important thing. If there are more aspects that you feel could apply, the question is, which would be the 3 most valid? There are more answers, But for our purposes and just to demonstrate, I'm providing only 3 because that is what is going to be marked in the exams. Let's move on. Basically the same introductory paragraph, the same diagram, and it asks, if the ratites indeed evolved from a common ancestor, explain how it is possible for them to be so widely distributed as indicated in the map below. So there we go. Look carefully. There you have your rheas in South America. You have the ostrich in Africa. You have the emu in Australia. The cassowary in Indonesia. And then your kiwi in New Zealand. So the question asks, but why this distribution? The idea here is, of course, that first of all we started off with a common supercontinent, Pangaea, and what then happened is we then had continental drift, which then separated these continents from each other. And what happened was the environmental conditions also changed, or compared South America with Africa, with Australia, New Zealand. So that because the environmental conditions did change. So let me just write down. So we also had a change in environmental conditions. And this then, of course, led to the development of new species by process of evolution. So let's just go back and recap. All these land masses were one. The supercontinent Pangaea, and what happened is as continental drift happened, these continents started moving away from each other, so that automatically meant that the latitude and of course in some cases the longitude then also changed, which meant that environmental conditions changed, and as the environmental conditions changed there was the development of new species by a process of evolution. Let's go to question 3.3. So according to the map, where is the smallest ratite found? So here we are linking. There we go. You can see the smallest living ratite is of course your kiwi. We know the kiwis from the sports, and so that automatically tells us that it is found in New Zealand. So that would then be our answer there. Let's move on to question 4. It states, look at the diagram and then answer the questions that follow. So as I mentioned to you previously, take a moment and just have a look at the diagrams. There's 1, 2, and 3. So you can see what has happened is that there were various land masses that were grouped together. It then started separating. So that's kind of an intermediate stage here at this point. And what we then finally have is you then see the distribution of land masses or continents as we know them. In other words, as we know them today. So the question is, what is shown in this diagram? And the answer is continental drift. Next it asks, define the term biogeography. Biogeography, we mentioned previously, basically indicates, there you can see bio relating to life, and geography, of course, distribution in terms of your land masses. So what we basically have here is we have the distribution of plant and animal life. I'm not going to write out I'm just going to summarize here. The distribution of plant and animal life over space and time. 4.3. Why does this phenomenon shown, in other words the continental drift in the diagram, play such an important role in biogeography? So if you look at where we started, in other words starting here, let's say that's point 1, 2, going down to 3, what has basically happened is that the organisms that were present in the supercontinent here, what happened is they were now separated from each other. And what eventually happened is, as they separated, some, as you can see, South America moved a little bit further down, so that would mean different environmental conditions. Northern America is a little bit higher up, Australia further down, etc. So with the change in longitude and latitude, you actually find that there's a change in environmental conditions, and this change in environmental conditions then led to the creation of new species, and the new species then developed through a process of evolution. Let's move on to question 5. Here we have a diagram showing Pangaea, or at least the continents much closer to each other. What you have is, you can see you have some organisms. For example, if you take this fern, Glossopteris, and look carefully, if you follow, you can see that here where it's indicated, in other words, it was present on Australia, Antarctica, India, Africa, and South America. Now the question is, many people will ask, but how do you know that? If you go to the bottom of the diagram, you'll see that it's a reconstruction based on various fossils. So what we find is that you would find fossils of Glossopteris. You would find Glossopteris in Australia. There were fossils found there. In Africa, in India, and you know that these continents are thousands of miles apart now. So the fact that there are fossils, similar fossils found, it meant that at a certain stage in time and space, that this Glossopteris was present in this specific form indicated here, or in the fossilized form. It was present at the same time in these various continents. Look at Lystrosaurus as an example. So if you follow Lystrosaurus here, you can see, following this mass here, it indicates that it was present here in Africa. It was present at the same time in India, and then also in Antarctica. So those are just two of the examples, and these are the things that you pick up. For example, Mesosaurus. There you can see Mesosaurus, indicating that Mesosaurus fossils have been found in South Africa, and it has also been found in the lower regions of South America, indicating that at some point those two continents were basically very close to one another or connected. So let's look at the questions. Remember, everything that I discussed now is what you basically go through even before you start answering the questions. So the answer, name the supercontinent visible in this diagram. Again, from the diagram you can see, there we go, Gondwana. So the supercontinent then is Gondwana land. Explain how fossil evidence supports the fact that there was once a supercontinent. So if we go back to the diagram, you can see, if we take as an example, and I mentioned it with Glossopteris, the fact that we found fossils in us, that we still find fossils in Australia, in Antarctica, in India, in Africa, and in South America, means that these continents were all connected to each other at some point. So, explain how fossil evidence supports. I will just mention Glossopteris as an example. Glossopteris fossils found on all continents illustrated in diagram. Oopsie, diagram. So the fact that there are Glossopteris fossils in all of the, in other words, still found today on all of those continents means that those continents were connected at some point. Then let's look at question 5.3. Which organism's fossil remains links all 6 land masses? Actually, I've been using the example constantly. And the answer is Glossopteris. And let's just go back and check. There we go. Here we have the mass. I'll just change the color just to indicate. There we have this mass here. And you can see, there we go. So it's present in Australia, Antarctica, India, Africa, and then South America. So our answer there is Glossopteris. Let's move on to question 6. Use the diagrams to answer the questions that follow. So if we look at these diagrams, we see a frog, we see a bird, and we see a seal. So the question is, why is there a variety? Why is there a variety of different forms of forelimbs in the various animals illustrated? So let's just have a look. We all know that frogs are amphibious, so they live in land and water. So we know how they move. They swim or by, of course, hopping. You have your birds that fly, and you have your seal with their flippers that, of course, swim. So let's see. Why is there this variety? We have different environments required different adaptations, and that is why we have these different forms. Give the mode of life that the forelimb has adapted to in the case of the frog, the bird, and then the seal. In my previous explanation, I of course mentioned that your frog is of course amphibious, which means it lives on land and water. We know that your bird's flying, okay? And then of course your seals living in aquatic or marine environments, and they are very well adapted to swimming. So let's have a look at 6.3. List 3 characteristics that each of these forelimbs that enables them to be classified as homologous structures. Now let's go back to our presentation. The idea behind homologous structures is that they have the same fundamental structure. In other words, they would have basically the same bones, and that indicates that they have a common ancestor. But remember, with homologous structures, the functions of the structures may be different, as indicated now. The fundamental structure is the same. So if you look at the 3 characteristics, the one would of course then be that the fundamental structure is similar. What another aspect is, of course, that it has, in other words, the same bones. If we're looking at the limbs, it would have these same bones, and then of course they would be in the same position. If you remember, when we look back at the homologous structure with the various colored bones, as we colored them indifferently, you could see that you would have the humerus, the radius, the ulna, the carpals, the metacarpals. In other words, the same bones are present. They are in the exact same position, which basically means that their fundamental structure will then be the same. Let's move on to 6.4. Explain why these forelimbs illustrate divergent evolution. So, why does it illustrate divergent evolution? Well, because they have a common ancestor. So, from the common ancestor, you would then find the basic structure, as I mentioned previously, with all the different types of bones, and then based on the environments. In other words, if you have an aquatic environment, a water environment, so then there will be changes. If you're in a terrestrial environment, that would then also change. Or if, for example, in the case of your birds that live in trees, that have an arboreal lifestyle, their fundamental structure would then adapt, in other words, to their lifestyle. So basically, answering the question, the forelimbs basically illustrate divergent evolution because they come from a common ancestor, and from the common ancestor they get the common or fundamental structure that's similar, which then just changes slightly depending on the environments in which they live. So I hope that the theory and questions that we went through in this presentation will be very useful to you and assist you in preparing for the final exams.